Well, there's another evidence of the global catastrophe, and that is the character of the flood. Back in the 19th century, when people were saying that the flood was not violent, they said, there's no evidence in the biblical text that it was a violent catastrophe. And when they said this, it just showed that they didn't read the English or the Hebrew very carefully. In Genesis chapter 7, we're told about the source of the water in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month. On the same day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were open. So the most well-known source of the water was the floodgates of the sky. The next verse says it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. And I thought that was all the time that it rained until I heard a paper by a Hebrew Old Testament scholar last year, in which he argued, and you can go back to the text and look at this, but he argued from the Hebrew, but I think it's also seems clear from the English, that the reference to the 40 days and 40 nights of rain was the time period until the ark started to float, but that the rain actually continued nonstop up until the 150th day. But in any case, this was not a spring rain to water the garden. This was a rain as an expression of the holy wrath of God. This was monsoon rain, 24 hours a day, day and night, for at least 40 days, and all over the earth. It would have caused mudslides that would make the California mudslides look like a Sunday school picnic. But then the primary source of water seems to be from the fountains of the great deep bursting open, because they are the first thing mentioned. And this word, or what we have in English, burst open, is actually one Hebrew verb. The fountains of the great deep refer to subterranean waters. The great deep in the Bible usually refers to the ocean. So this is subterranean water coming in to the oceans. And we have lots and lots of subterranean water on the earth today. Most of our drinking water comes from underground water. And there's hot, briny water coming into the ocean floor even today. Now, burst open. This is a Hebrew word that is used several other places in the Old Testament, and it is loaded with geological significance. It is used in the book of Numbers when Korah rebels against Moses' leadership, and God says, I'm going to judge Korah, and I want the people of Israel to move away from Korah and his livestock and his people and his tents. And the scriptures say that the ground opened. It's the same Hebrew verb. And it was a small earthquake, and their tents and livestock and people went into the ground, and then the ground closed. It's the same word that's used in Judges when Samson was thirsty, and the rock split and water came out. It's the same verb that's used in Zechariah 14:4 when it talks about the second coming of the Messiah, and it says that the Lord's foot will touch the Mount of Olives, and the mountain will split in two, and a huge valley will form. So this verb is loaded with geological significance. It's telling us that the crust of the earth began to break apart all over the earth, and water came onto the earth under high pressure. Whenever we have a volcano or an earthquake on the bottom of the ocean today, it sets off tidal waves. These become what are known as tsunamis as they approach a landmass. And they can go for thousands of miles across the ocean floor at speeds up to 600 miles an hour. And when they rise up and reach the land mass, they can carry ships a mile inland and do incredible damage to the land. So we have evidence of violence at the beginning of the flood. But we also see evidence in the recessional phase of the flood. In Genesis 8:3, it says, the waters receded steadily from the earth, and at the end of 150 days, the waters decreased. This adverb steadily is actually two verbs in the Hebrew, and they are two of the most common verbs in the Hebrew. They are the verb to go and the verb to return. So the waters, literally, the waters are receding, going, and returning in Hebrew. This is moving water. As the waters are receding, they're moving. What does moving water do? It carries sediments. And so in the recessional phase of the flood, the waters are going to be moving. Some of the sediments that were deposited in the first half of the flood are going to be moved somewhere else. Psalm 104 also alludes to the flood. Many people say this is a creation passage, this whole psalm. But I don't think so. I think if we look carefully at verses 8 and 9, it is talking about the flood. It says that the mountains rose and the valleys sank down to the place which you established for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass over, so that they will not return to cover the earth. If that's referring to the third day of creation when God made dry land, then the flood was a violation of that statement. I think that is a statement about the flood. And it tells us that the land mass, the crust of the earth shifted in the recessional stage of the flood. And so the mountains rose and the valleys sank. Now, if you combine earthquakes and volcanoes, like the earthquake that we saw in Turkey a few years ago, with floods, like the one in Nicaragua a few years ago, you are going to have a catastrophe of unimaginable magnitude. Now look at that water. Wouldn't you like to just take a cup and just scoop in there and get a drink? Why does it look so brown? It looks brown because it's carrying sediments. And if we could do a stop-action cut through that water, we would find that that water is not just carrying microscopic particles of silt and maybe some sand grains. It's carrying boulders. And that house didn't last very long, I'm sure. And so the flood was a violent, violent catastrophe. All of the plant materials ripped up off the land. All the land creatures were drowned in the flood, taken from whatever they were hanging on to. And there was massive, massive erosion and sedimentation going on. Then there's the depth of the flood. The Bible tells us how deep it was in Genesis 7. It says, the waters prevailed more and more upon the earth, so that all the high mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered. The water prevailed 15 cubits higher, and the mountains were covered. Now, let's suppose that we're all mountains in here, and let's suppose that this little thing here is like Elijah's jar, or was it Elisha, the jar of oil that never ran out. And I start pouring water on the mountains down here. What's going to happen? Well, the water's just going to pile up on top of their head, isn't it? No. It's water seeks a level plain. It's going to run down the shoulders. And so if I want to cover this mountain, I'm going to have to cover a lot of other mountains. But I'm a mountain too, so I've got to keep pouring to cover me. But we got a problem. The doors in the auditorium here are not watertight. The water's going to leak out the doors. It's going to go down the road to the campground here. And then it's going to go down the roads to Harrison. And so I'm going to have to pour a lot of water just to get this mountain covered. The only way to get all the high mountains under heaven covered is a global flood. Those who believe in a local flood believe that it was in the Mesopotamian valley. And to believe in a local flood, you've got to believe in something like this. Now, this is not an actual photograph. This is an artistic design by one of our artists in our office. No such flood really exists in the world. Never has. The only way you could have a flood like this is if God put His hands around all that water and kept it all contained. There's a problem with that view, though. There's nothing in the text of Genesis that says God did any kind of supernatural action like that. On the contrary, the whole text of the flood account is going out of its way to tell us He didn't do anything like that, that He was destroying the whole world.